bunch of the other social media sources that I use as well. But if you follow the link at the top and join on HAPS, that's usually the best way. Right, hopefully I'm back now. Just briefly disappeared. The server and the HAPS side, as far as I can tell, fell over. So if people missed that, this is another broadcast here on HAPS. Do follow the link at the top to join. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go and have a look at and talk about some of the moths at a survey I ran here in Perivale Wood on Saturday, not on Friday, as I typed into the title of the broadcast. We've been having a few internet connectivity issues today, so it may be this will fall apart, in which case I will attempt to restart a separate broadcast to finish. But with that said, we will give it a go. I say I'm down here at Perivale Wood, that's where I am now, and that's where I ran the moth survey. It's a nature reserve that I'm involved in running here in northwest London. And on Saturday night, I had out a series of moth traps, a series of light traps that attract moths to the light. The moths go into the trap, into the box, sit on some egg containers, egg boxes in there, and I can then go in the morning, work out what we've got, and I did an ongoing study of the Lepidoptera of this reserve, which is somewhere we've been studying these things, not me personally, of course, but where they've been studied by people since the early 1960s. So quite a long period of recording on the site. Anyway, with no further ado, we'll start to have a look at some of the moths that we found. They're not in any particular order, which is in a sense how they would come out of a moth trap, of course. They would come out of a moth trap, not in a particular order either. So this will be a bit random, it'll be a bit of a jump through, they won't be in a sort of taxonomically coherent order, but that's something like the authentic experience of going through a moth trap. You get things in the order they come in. And we'll say a little bit about each one, about its status, about where it feeds on, possibly comment on what we know about it on this reserve. So with no further ado, let's go to the first of these images, and I need to swap this round so you're looking at the moth, not me. So this species is one of the commonest species at this time of year that we get. It's called the Squarespot Rustic. There's quite often a tendency to call this sort of the browner moths the rustics. And this one is called the Squarespot Rustic, possibly because of that relatively square-shaped mark on the wing towards the bottom. It's a common species. It's common nationally and it's common on this site. It's moderately variable in its markings. It takes a little while when you first start looking at moths to get your eye into seeing the common features on this and not finding some of the slightly differently marked ones and thinking there's something more interesting. And the larvae feed on quite a variety of grasses and herbaceous plants. So quite a lot of stuff it can feed on, which in part is probably why it is a common species. Almost by definition, the common things that feed on a lot of common stuff are going to find it easier to be common. I mean, there are some exceptions of things that feed on common plants that are nevertheless quite rare. So we'll bring the next species up. Which will hopefully appear in a second. No, that's not what I told you to do. So this species, again, is another common species that we have got plenty of, just starting to be on the wing in the last week or so, this species, and this is called a straw underwing. The hind wing, which you can't see, of course, because the moth is all closed up here, but the hind wing of this species is a sort of yellowy lemon straw colour, hence the vernacular name. I'm not particularly going to go through all the scientific names. I'm putting them up on the screen so people have got them. And the scientific names, in this case Salophylla matura, are useful internationally, of course, because they're the same everywhere, whereas it's really only in the United Kingdom that we would call this the straw underwing, and people in other countries, probably even other English-speaking countries, may well give it a different name, and certainly countries that spoke another language would. But the scientific name is used internationally. It means the same everywhere. And again, this is a common species, and again, it feeds on a wide variety of common plants, grasses in this case, which is probably why it can be a common species. It's not dependent on some extremely rare plant that isn't around. Now, the next one I will bring up is rather structurally different. I'm going to do something else with this one whilst I'm on. Also to bring that up. Do that. And take me off for a second. So these two moths, although they look rather different, are both the same species. And both of these are a species called the ribband wave, Idaea aversata. And again, this is a common plant. And again, its larvae feed on quite a variety of different herbaceous plants, rather than being really restricted to one particular species. And say it's called the ribband wave. I will put that name up again. And it has two distinct, different looking forms. The form on the right, the picture on the right with the somewhat dark bar through the center of the wing. It's rather a faded example, unfortunately, but it's got that thickened dark bar, is what's called the typical form. And the moth on the left is the same species, ribband wave, but it's got that bar not filled in, and that is called the form remutata of ribband wave. It's actually somewhat commoner than is the typical form. And it occurs, well, yeah, we get quite a few of them. Right, let me bring the next image up, or the next species up, if I take that off. Take this off. Bring myself back into the picture so you can see me again, if you're so inclined. And this moth is it's not an unusual species at all. This is a common species. This is called the Cetaceous Hebrew character, or Zestia C. nigrum. C. nigrum, I guess, would translate to something like black letter C, which is what the people giving it the scientific name obviously thought that black marking looks like. The vernacular name, Cetaceous Hebrew character. Cetaceous means hairy. I think is referring to the larvae of this, which have some hairs. But Hebrew character, the thinking was that the markings on the wing resembled one of the characters, one of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. No, I don't read Hebrew, so I've got no idea if that's right or not. If anybody watching this does read Hebrew and wants to type in the chat which letter they think it looks like, that would be great. I've been told various letters by people in the past, so it may well be that it's more of a fanciful resemblance than a particularly strong resemblance to a particular character, particular letter. So I'm just going to do a bit of tidying up in the background here. So that was Cetaceous Hebrew character. We'll move on to the next image now, and I'll bring that to the front. And this one, again, this is one that we've seen before, and again, it is a common species. This one has rather a cumbersomely long name. Let me put that up on the screen. This is the lesser broad-bordered yellow underwing, or Noctua janthe, if you want its short scientific name. And again, it's a common species, feeds on quite a range of herbaceous plants, and is again pretty common. Again, as the name suggests, the yellow underwing talks about the colour of the wing that's hidden away behind the closed-up moth here, which is yellow. It has a dark border to it, and it is a smaller moth than another one called the broad-bordered yellow underwing. So that's how the name all got put together. The divisions on the ruler that you can see on the image are all approximately 1 millimeter in length, and that way so you can get a sense of the scale of it. I haven't actually got a broad-bordered yellow underwing in the trap to show you, but all of these specimens that I'm uploading here are species that are the specimens that were in the trap. So these are the moths that you would see if you had joined me here. So we'll bring the next species up, which is this one. No, you want to make the moth the main image. There we go. So this one was a rather slightly hooked shape to the wing. It's got a slight hook that you can see at the end of the wing. It's called the oak hooktip, and there's a group of moths in the hooktips family that have this sort of shape to the wing, this sort of slightly curved, hooked round corner to the wing there. This one is the oak hooktip, and it's the commonest of the hooktips. Certainly the commonest of the hooktips here. I think it's nationally the commonest as well. The larvae of it feed on oak. I think they've very occasionally been recorded from other broadleaf trees, but oak predominantly, hence the name. And rather an attractive species. Again, a common species, one that we see quite frequently in lots of places. So we'll keep motoring through these, bring the next moth up. And this is called the blood vein. This is quite an attractive moth. I rather like blood vein. Oh, that should have gone away by now. I rather like the blood vein as a moth. It's got this red vein across the forewing, which is the source of the name blood vein, as you can imagine. And its larvae feed on quite a variety of plants. Docks, common orac, I have no idea how to pronounce that plant. Common sorrel, knotgrass. I found some on nettle earlier this year, which isn't listed as explicitly as a food plant in the literature I've seen, but that's what it was on. And I reared one through this year, which we looked at on an earlier broadcast. The caterpillars of blood vein are quite interesting of mimics of snakes. Although they're much smaller than any snake that you could plausibly see. They do resemble snakes rather a lot. Oops. Just running into some challenges with some stuff going on in the background. I've got slightly more images of moths than HAPS allows me to upload to the system. which is a little bit irritating. So I'm having to sort of upload stuff in the background whilst we're talking. This is the blood vein. It is another common species, feeds on quite a variety of plants, and is one I've reared on this year. But the point of the camouflage there that it's got is that it's designed, I would think, designed is the wrong word, of course it is, it has evolved to look like a leaf with a leaf vein through it. So when it's sitting there, it's camouflaged and not easy for something that might want to feed on it to see it and eat it. So we'll bring the next species up that we found. This light green coloured one. Many of the green coloured moths are called emeralds, and this one is rather lighter in colour and is hence goes by the light emerald. And again, it's another common species. It's another species we get quite frequently. This is probably a relatively fresh one. One of the interesting things about some of the green coloured moths is that the green colour can often fade quite quickly. So if you get them after they've been on the wing for a few days, you can often find that the colours are much paler than when they're fresh. But this one seems relatively fresh. That green colour is pretty decent here. And again, you can see this moth's got those lines running across the wing, which perhaps break up the pattern, which perhaps mean that when you look at it sitting amongst trees, it looks like a leaf with some leaf veins, and therefore is a bit protected from things that might wish to feed on it. The next species that's coming up, oops, should have done that the other way around. This is one that it's probably the first, I think it's the first one we've found or we've shown so far that is not a common species. This is a nationally scarce species. It's called the Mocha. And if people watched my broadcast last week, you might recall that this is a species that until this year, indeed until last week, had not actually occurred on this site in all of the years that we have been recording moths here. And it turned up for the first time last week, and that was rather nice. I was pleasantly surprised. Always nice to add a new species to a site that's been well recorded. And again, it turned up in one of the traps on Saturday. So the Mocha, a nationally scarce species, and its larvae are restricted largely to feeding on field maple, although it possibly could take some other trees in the same genus as that, Acer. Field maple is the only native British tree in genus Acer. And it's not the commonest of trees, which is perhaps why the moth is also less common than some of the others we've seen. It's got this quite interesting wave zigzaggy pattern. Again, it's probably something to do with camouflage, probably something to do with how it stays hidden. And this was a species that until this year and until last week had never been recorded from this site, despite many, many years of recording of moths here. Right, we'll zip through another couple of species now. So this coming up is the green carpet. Common species, feeds on bed straws, type of plant, or the larvae feed on bed straws. And again, this is quite a fresh one because again, like some of the other green moths, it will fade quite quickly. And here's another species, very bright, and one that you can see can be disturbed quite easily by day, can this moth. This is the Brimstone Moth. Got quite a lengthy scientific name, Pistodographis luteolata. And again, it's a common species. The larvae feed on blackthorn and hawthorn, which are both common hedgerow plants, of which there are loads in this reserve. But it's a really attractive, bright yellow, distinctive moth. Although surprisingly, when it's sitting up in a sunlit hedgerow, it can be remarkably tricky to see. That yellow colour sort of reflects, and these little brown markings make it look a bit like a twig or a broken thing. Having a bit of a week, yes, Fiona? Here we are. Hello, Fiona. Welcome to the broadcast. This is perhaps a poor substitute for Fiona for joining me here. Fiona often joins me at the moth trapping sessions here in Perivale Wood. But this is an alternative way to look at them. So here we go, another of our common species, the flame shoulder, so named after these slightly reddish streaks, bars down the side of the wing. And again, it's a common species, and again, like many of the common species, its larvae feed on a wide variety of different herbaceous plants, which probably helps it be a common species. Right, moving on now to our first of what get called the micro moths. Moths are rather arbitrarily broken into two groups, the macro moths, which are well studied, and the micro moths, which are less well studied. And there we go. Hello, Roland. Thank you for the Appreciate Award. It is appreciated. The awards that I get on here and the money that they eventually turn into will all be used to support things like Perivale Wood, where I've been doing these surveys. Anyway, so what was I saying? Yes, the moths are broken into two slightly arbitrary groups, the macro moths, which tend to be bigger, and the micro moths, which tend to be smaller. The macro moths are a bit better studied and a bit easier to identify and see. But there are some of the smaller moths, and I do try my best to identify everything. This is one of the grass veneer moths, Agrophila geniculea. I haven't put a vernacular name down for this. It sometimes gets called the elbow striped grass veneer after these kinked cross lines on it. And it's another of our common species. The larvae feed on grasses, as do quite a few other moths in this family. And you'll often disturb them by day. If you walk through tall grassland, you'll often see little silvery golden moths flitting up, kicked up by walking through, which are typically things in this genus. Agrophila geniculea is one of the later flying ones. Been on the wing for a few weeks here. And again, just to give a sense of scale, the divisions on the ruler shown at the top here are in millimeters. And rather a different scale of moth coming up. So this is the Jersey tiger moth. And this is a moth that was extremely rare in the United Kingdom until comparatively recently, and largely confined to the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey, and very occasionally on the south coast. So its national status is still that it is scarce, but the population is currently expanding really rapidly, particularly here in the London area. The larvae feed on a wide variety of herbaceous plants, so its scarce distribution was not about food plant scarcity. Maybe it was a climate thing, maybe it's a urban heat island thing is letting it survive here in London where it's warmer than the surrounding countryside. But over the past 10 years or so, this has gone from being something that you had no chance of seeing to being one of the commoner moths in the area. So the Jersey tiger, we may put the right name up there. And it is a large, distinctive species. Right. Another large species coming up, not quite as large as the Jersey tiger, but nevertheless large. And this one, helpfully with large in its name, is the large yellow underwing, or Noctua pronuba. Again, it's got a yellow hindwing, which is all concealed and out of sight here. But it's quite a large moth, called the large yellow underwing, because it's one of the larger ones with these yellow underwings. And again, it feeds on a lot of different stuff, a lot of herbaceous plants, a lot of grasses. And again, it's common, but rather an attractive species, I think. Certainly something I'm always nice to see. It has an alternative vernacular name because it has a tendency to fly quite actively around the trap and smash everything about and disturb everything that you're trying to look at. It gets, you just had one of your moths on your window in Wiltshire. Excellent. Yellow, orange, red, Fiona. Oh, Fiona was asking about the Jersey tiger. I think that was one of the ones with the yellow hindwing, Fiona. And Roland had one of these on his windows in Wiltshire. Excellent. Well, just, yes, having your windows and leaving a light on is a way that you can get to see some moths, which is always good. Anyway, this is large yellow underwing, or because it flies around and disturbs everything, the blunderwing, as we sometimes call it. Running down the list. The HAPS interface is not the easiest thing for doing this, because whenever you select an image, it moves it to a different place in the list of images and you have to scroll back up. Anyway, that's enough whinging about HAPS. It's a very good platform, to be fair. It's just got some odd idiosyncrasies. This is an orange swift moth, Hepialus sylvina. At least that's what it is in the book I've used here. I think the genus name has actually, the first part of the scientific name has actually been changed now. But it's a common enough moth again. It feeds on the roots. Its larvae basically burrow underneath the surface into the roots of a wide variety of herbaceous plants. Let's keep going, let's keep going, let's keep going. This one that is coming up, I am not 100% certain of the identification here. So we'll put it there. Oops, take that off. So this is definitely one of the moths in the Hoplodrina group. And I think this is Vines rustic, Hoplodrina ambigua. And the scientific name perhaps gives you a clue that this is a group of moths that are quite tricky to identify. There are lots of several very similar species in the genus Hoplodrina, but this is Hoplodrina ambigua, which is a Vines rustic and has quite a pale hindwing. At least I think it is. I'm going to examine this properly later on and make sure it is that before I submit the data anyway. But I'm 90% sure it's that, so I thought I'd share it here anyway. But there are tricky moths to identify, and you've got to be careful. Right, let's see what we've got here. Oops, did that wrong again. Put me on the screen. So this moth, somewhat smaller and with this pattern on this fairly large distinctive dark patch towards the trailing edge of the forewing, goes by the name of the single dotted wave, Idea dimidiata, or dimidiata, something like that. the mediata. There we go. It's a fairly small moth, which is perhaps what the scientific name is referring to. And the larvae of it feed on cow parsley, burnet saxifrage, hedge bed straw. Cow parsley is probably the commonest of those. I can see loads of them just looking out of the window behind my broadcast. Again, a common species. Most things we're finding are common, which is kind of what you'd expect. Common stuff, almost by definition, is commoner than rare stuff. But another attractive species, I rather like this one. And again, one, although it's night flying, it's one of the ones that I find reasonably frequently by the day. Most years I'll find one or two of these just when I'm wandering around. We'll come to another of the micro moths. That's the arbitrary grouping of moths that are smaller. And this one goes by the name of the light brown apple moth. Let me see if I can find that and put it on there. Or Epiphyus postvetena. It is now a common species. It's been in Britain just over a century, I think, maybe a bit more than a century. And it's a species that is Australasian in origin, certainly from Australia, and I think from some other parts of the Australasian continent. And it feeds on a huge variety of things. In Australia, it's noted as a pest species on orchards, hence the apple moth, bit of its scientific name. And I guess the light brown bit because its colour's brown and light. But it can feed on a wide variety of things. Indeed, it's probably got one of the widest ranges of recorded food plants of moths that are known. And there are stories that somebody reared it on a packet of crisps or things pulled out. So it can clearly feed on a lot. I'm not sure that story is entirely true, but it does seem to feed on almost anything. There's a light brown apple moth, and it's now a very common moth in Britain, despite being from the other side of the planet originally and having been accidentally introduced here, but with, I suspect, agricultural products. This is part of a group of moths, one of the moths in the group known as the pugs. And the pugs are a notoriously difficult group to identify. They tend to be small, they tend to not be particularly distinctly marked, and they tend to just be hard work. But this is one of the pugs that isn't difficult. This is the lime spec pug. Eupathicea is the genus of all the pugs. And it feeds, again, it's one of these, it's fairly common, and again, its larvae feed on quite a variety of low-growing plants. So again, it's got plenty of opportunities. But it's distinctive, it's white, it's pale, it's got these dark spots and dark patches, and that makes it, unusually for pug moth, pretty easy to identify. Now, the traps I run are designed to attract moths, that's what I'm looking for. But sometimes you get things that aren't moths. And that's what this is. This is not a moth. This is a hornet, a species of large wasp. About an inch or so long, 2.5 centimeters, something like that. Quite large. They do have a sting on them. They can't sting. Hornets are typically a fairly placid type of wasp. I wouldn't be that bothered if I was sitting here and there was a hornet's nest off to my side. They'd just be flying in and out, doing their thing and ignoring me. But they do come to the light occasionally, typically fairly early on in the night, early evening, because they're not a nocturnal species. And although they're a fairly placid thing, if you get them in a moth trap, they will do two things. One is they will quite possibly eat many of the moths in your trap, which is not helpful. It's hard to identify something when it's been dissected by a hornet and digested by a hornet. But the other thing is, if you are a bit careless going through the trap in the morning and you do put your hand on one of these. They can be provoked to sting you. It can be a bit uncomfortable. But I got away unstung, so I think that was a good thing. And this is another moth. This is a moth that is mainly regarded as a day-flying species. But this one did come to a light trap at night, so they do fly at night as well. And let me put its name up. This is a vaporer moth. And it is a male vaporer moth. Lots of male moths have these big feathery antennae, which they use to smell out the females. But in this species, the difference between male and female is much more distinctive. In this species, the female essentially doesn't have any wings. She has tiny vestigial wing buds, effectively. And she can't fly, obviously, as something without wings can't do. And she basically emerges from her pupa, often doesn't even leave the pupal case. The male smells her out with these big feathery antennae, comes and mates. She lays her eggs, again, often around the pupal case where she was, and then dies. But the males are much more distinctive, bright orange in colour, with these big antennae. And again, these are a species that you will often find by day, but they spend a lot of their time by the day flying up the top there, around the canopy, quite hard to see. And then our final species that we've got to look at today is another species that is a comparatively recent arrival in the United Kingdom and is not a particularly welcomed one. This is a species that I think is East Asian in origin. And this is called the box moth. Comparatively recent arrival in the United Kingdom, probably accidentally introduced with the horticultural trade. The larvae feed on and do massive damage to box plants. So if you've got box trees in your garden, if you've got a box hedge, if you're in the south of England, this is probably the thing, or its caterpillars are probably the thing that are absolutely trashing your box hedge. It's a species that's arrived here and is now spreading and is, again, one I get very commonly. I haven't had vast numbers this year, so I do wonder if it's had a bad year. Maybe there's some hope for people's box hedges this year. Who knows? So that is the box moth. Technically a micro moth, although as you can see from the size of it, it's bigger than some of the macro moths, the larger moths that we have seen. But it is classified in with the micro moths because it's from that family. And despite all the damage it does to box trees, it is rather an attractive species. I do rather like the appearance of box moth. So what I'll do now is I'll put a few more of these images back up on screen. See how many pictures we're allowed to show on HAPS. And we'll end with just one or two of them. Take me off because I'm boring. I'm not nearly as interesting as a moth. I think I'm allowed 8 images up. Let me see. Did I get both morphs? No, I didn't get any of the dark form of the box moth this time. I think I've only had one of the dark form. It does have a different colour form, which is what Fiona's referring to. I think I've only had one of the dark form this year, actually. And actually, it technically has 3 colour forms. There's also a form with an extra bit of a brown bar on it, which I haven't seen at all this year. Anyway, there's some of the moths. That's a good place to end on. It's been a useful session, useful to go and do the recording. I will this evening be sitting keying all these into the database on my computer so that the records can go to the National Recording Scheme and everyone can see things. And yeah, I will continue to do these broadcasts from here in Perivale Wood when I've done a moth trap, just to share things with people. This method I've tried a couple of times where I take photographs and show the photographs rather than trying to show the moths live. It seems to work better technologically, although in some ways I'd rather we were actually looking at things live, but this plays with the technology a bit better. So I'll continue to experiment with those methods, and we'll continue to do the surveys, and hopefully I will see some of you here again. And we'll end here with just a picture of some of the moths from Perryvale Wood here in northwest London. And I wish you all a good afternoon.